Chapter 43, Disguised PT2. Nearly 2 hours had passed. Ruby was sitting on the rug, starving, wondering how Maya's rabbit flesh would taste. No one would know if Ruby just slaughtered her right now. Ruby could take the body with her back to camp, eat every little scrap. And then Maya began to stir, her breathing pattern changing. Ruby snapped out of it, bringing herself back to her senses and wiping the trickle of saliva off her chin. She got up and walked to the kitchen, looking for a cup. Pulling a chipped mug out of one of the cabinets, she poured some of the cold tea and took a gulp, trying to clear her mind. Ruby was sitting at the table and drinking the cold liquid when Maya woke up. "What time is it?" Maya asked groggily. Ruby checked the clock on the wall. "It's nearly 8. Should have woken me up earlier," Maya said, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. "Aren't you hungry?" "I'm fine," Ruby lied, ignoring her rumbling stomach. "You seemed really tired, so I just let you sleep." Maya pulled her blanket off of herself, getting up. "Thanks, but that's still creepy," she said. "Let me change, and then we'll go." She was still wearing her police uniform underneath the blankets, and Ruby tried not to stare at her behind as Maya walked toward her bedroom. A few minutes later, they were ready to go, Maya having switched into a more casual set of dress shirt and dress pants, still maintaining a business-like appearance. She had her hair let down, and she switched from police boots to a pair of black flats. Realizing that it was cold outside, Maya slipped on a green parka, buttoning it up. "Can I just leave my weapons and clothes here?" Ruby asked worriedly. "Will they be safe?" "Should be," Maya said. "If you want, I can lock them up in the basement lockbox." Ruby picked up her bundle. "That would be great," she said, relieved. The two went down to the basement, where Maya slid open one of the cabinets on the walls. Pulling out a key ring, she unlocked the safe, the hinges squeaking open. "I don't have anything valuable in there," Maya said, taking the key off of the ring. "So here's the key." "Thanks," Ruby said gratefully, sliding the key into her pocket. She slid her bundled up side inside, the safe barely fitting the dimensions of her weapon wrapped in her cloak. "Alright, so we're first going to go get dinner," Maya said, pulling out a wallet and checking its contents before slipping it back into her pocket. "And then we're going to a bar." I don't know if I can drink," Ruby said uncertainly, following her up the stairs. "What do you mean?" Maya asked, opening the front door. Ruby followed her outside, hands nervously stroking her hair. "I'm not of legal age yet," she explained. Maya closed the door, locking it. "Don't you kids drink all the time?" "Well, I don't," Ruby protested. "Can't I just ask for a glass of milk or something?" Maya sighed. "Well, shit," she muttered. "Maybe I'll just tell them you're allergic to alcohol." "Them?" Ruby asked, walking alongside her. They were nearing the border of the small, empty neighborhood, the center of town off in the distance. A single road led to it, the snow-cleared path sprinkled with lampposts, the only thing breaking the monotony of the cleared space between the two areas. "I've been trying to get closer to the other members of the police force," Maya said, stuffing her hands into her pockets. "I'm not trying to get into their pants," Maya said quickly, seeing the look on Ruby's face. "I'm just trying to get information directly from them." "Why are you trying this method now?" Ruby asked. Maya looked up into the clear night sky, the dim light from the lampposts illuminating her face. "It's a sort of last-ditch effort, really. I haven't been making any progress recently and I haven't been able to find any new evidence. I have to patrol for nearly half of the day, and then I go back to the office, where they try to pile busywork on me to make it seem like the police department is actually doing something. So you don't have enough time. Not only that, but the perpetrators seem to be hiding really well, and I can't be everywhere at once. Right now I'm investigating one of the more recent cases of burglary that the investigators have dropped, but I'm getting nowhere. Can I help in any way? That's why we're going to one of the bars frequented by a lot of police officers. If we can get them to trust us and believe that we're on their side, then we could easily prevent the next crime and gather evidence that even the council can't ignore. So why the council won't do anything right now? Surely they can't just be ignoring all of those crimes. They're too wrapped up in their own affairs, in their own communities, and they won't bother helping as long as no one dies. If you've met the council, you'll have seen that it's made up of 3 carnivores, a lynx, a wolf, and a bear. And don't forget, the leader is a lion. Those faunus won't lift a finger to help the herbivore communities. The bison are proud and headstrong and unwilling to care for much outside of their own clan, and hares are notoriously solitary and scheming. Nobody has died? Ruby asked, curious. How is that possible? It's been mostly burglary and assault, Maya said angrily. They know they can't risk angering the council members, so they're just being careful enough not to kill anyone. Oh, was all Ruby could say. They walked in silence for a while, approaching the border of the town. Ruby spoke first. So what's the plan? Like I said, this is a desperate attempt to actually find something, so. You don't have a plan, Ruby finished. That's cool, that means we're not restricted by anything. Maya said, unconvinced. Let's get dinner first, and then we can brainstorm after we eat something. They entered the outskirts of the town, seeing a few people walking down the street, the suburbs filled with low buildings. The taller buildings were in the middle of town, where most of the people were. Street lamps were spaced throughout the streets, lighting up the road and letting the two read the signs on the buildings. Where are all the cars? Ruby asked, noticing how empty the roads were. We don't have many vehicles in this town because we don't have any need for them, Maya said, leading her down one of the alleys. The only things we have are large trucks to transport materials. Otherwise, we just walk everywhere and run if we're in a hurry. Maya stopped at one of the lit shops, a sign on the front window proclaiming it is the Herbivore Eatery. Ruby noted how most of the patrons seemed to be, as the sign said, herbivores, with nary a carnivore in sight. The shop was small but well lit and warm, round tables in the center of the room with booths at the sides of the room. Maya chose a table in one of the corners that had 2 chairs, beckoning a waiter over. Can you handle spicy foods? Maya asked, shrugging off her parka. As long as it's not anything crazy, I should be fine, Ruby responded. 2 spicy noodles and 2 barley teas, Maya ordered. The waiter nodded, scribbling on a pad, and walked through a door in the back and into the kitchen. What's with the whole herbivore thing? Ruby wondered. And do you guys only drink tea or something? Red, this is a growing settlement, and food supplies are relatively limited, Maya explained. The main staple here is noodles and other wheat products, along with a variety of vegetables for the herbivores. The carnivores have their own restaurants and food sources. Does this relate to what you said about the council being carnivores? Maya nodded. This settlement has some issues. One is that due to the unprocessed nature of the foods here, you'll see huge divides between the communities. A lot of faunas eat mostly vegetables, including the more omnivorous ones, and then you have the other half of carnivores that eat meat products. They have their own slaughterhouses in one area of New Haven, and none of the herbivorous faunas will go close to that area. You sure know a lot, Ruby said, surprised at the depth of knowledge Maya possessed. Maya scoffed. I'm a police officer, it's my job to know this town. The noodles arrived quickly, 2 large steaming bowls being placed in front of them, along with 2 cups of tea. Vegetables and mushrooms filled the bowl, and the soup gave off a savory smell. Ruby preferred meat herself, but she was ravenous right now and anything would do. Can that problem be fixed? Ruby asked, shoveling noodles into her mouth. Maya swallowed before speaking. Not until we get more people and this settlement grows larger. We can't deny the carnivores the right to their food, and the herbivore population is not large enough to start raising a meaningful protest. The criminals can just keep suppressing the outcries of all the people they terrorize, and the herbivores can't do anything. Ruby realized what she was implying. So you're saying that the perpetrators are the carnivorous faunas, she whispered, wide-eyed. Maya nodded. Even the police force is 90% carnivores, she said. They're the naturally aggressive ones, and while in society they might be the perfect police officers, in New Haven they are unrestrained and a danger to the population. So how can you get them to trust you if you're a rabid faunus? They respect me, Maya grinned, flaring her aura to demonstrate what she was saying. Even here, aura users are rare, and they know I'll be able to take down most of them in a one-on-one fight. It took me a few days to settle some things when I first arrived here. Ruby nodded, slurping her noodles. Stop that, Maya frowned, lightly smacking her hand. That's not polite. Ruby wiped her mouth with a napkin, making an effort to eat more silently. The food was delicious, despite being vegetarian, and Ruby savored every last drop of soup as she finished the bowl. Maya was already finished, taking out her wallet and setting down a few lean. Wait, we don't have a plan yet, Ruby said, trying out the barley tea and making a face. Maya downed her tea in one gulp, standing up. We can talk on the way, she said, pulling her chair aside and putting her parka back on. Ruby followed her outside, the cool night air brushing against her skin. So this issue isn't just about the crimes, right? Maya nodded. The reason that these criminals can just do whatever they want is because this settlement isn't developed enough yet, the police force is corrupt, and because there's too much of an herbivore and carnivore divide between the victim faunus and the criminal faunus. The streets grew more populated as they neared the center of the town, a lot of people roaming the streets in groups and talking, many of them making their way down to one of the bars ahead of the two. Maya stopped, turning to face Ruby. Okay, so the plan is for me to introduce you as a friend who's just recently stopped being a loner and is living at my place, alright? That's actually pretty accurate, Ruby noted. Maya ignored her. Don't hurt anyone, don't make anyone suspicious, and don't talk too much. And don't ask them random questions. Gotcha, Ruby said, a little nervous. Don't suck up to them, but answer anything that won't reveal much, Maya added, taking off her parka and pushing open the door. The establishment was large and filled with faunus. A wooden countertop ran the length of it, shelves of alcohol displayed in the back, and small tables and chairs were scattered throughout the room. Groups of people were in the back playing cards or dice, a few slapping down lean and betting. Servers bustled throughout the room, cleaning tables and grabbing empty glasses. The room smelled odd, a mixture of clashing scents, and Ruby noticed that the groups of people seemed to be mostly divided by their carnivore or herbivore statuses, neither of the groups interacting with each other. A team of bartenders were rapidly mixing drinks for the customers sitting at the wooden countertop, and a display on the wall played some sort of movie that no one was paying attention to. The faunus were dressed in a mixture of things, a few still in their work clothes, some wearing hoodies, while others were neatly dressed in suits and ties. Maya made a beeline for a cat faunus sitting at the bar. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans that displayed his prominent muscles, a casual pair of running shoes in his feet. He had yellow eyes, his pupils a tiny dot in his irises. He had short, jet black hair and similarly black triangular ears, with predatory features that even Ruby could notice. Jaguar, Maya whispered as they approached him. He's an officer. He looked up as they approached, a bored expression on his face as he downed another shot. His nose twitched a little as they arrived, his eyes suddenly staring at them. And then his arms were wrapped around Ruby, his body pressed into hers, Ruby's head at his chest. He was like a furnace, his body hard and hot. Ruby was taken by surprise but stilled her arms, remembering what Maya had said. His mouth pressed against her ear, his lips burning her skin. I can smell the blood, he whispered throatily. Ruby froze, her blood turning cold despite the heat. Emmett, get off of her, Maya growled. She's a friend. He held onto her for a few more seconds before releasing her, stepping back. You don't have a smell, he said curiously, sitting back down. What's your name? Maya had an oh crap expression on her face as she realized what she had forgotten to tell Ruby. Ah, Rose, Ruby stammered. Ah, so you're a reptile of some sort, he nodded, understanding her lack of scent. Where are Cedric and Keith? Maya asked, sitting down on one of the stools and ordering a drink. Ruby followed her lead, sitting down next to her and away from Emmett. Oh, they're busy tonight, Emmett said, grinning. Lots of work to do. Ruby barely listened to their conversation as she thought about what Emmett had said. Surely he didn't know who she was. He said that he recognized her as a reptile faunus, but what if he was lying? Ruby was broken out of her reverie by the mention of her name. So who's the new girl? Emmett asked. Rose doesn't seem to talk much. Maya paused, taking in the new turn of the conversation. She used to be a loner, Maya explained. And then she got lonely, so she's living with me now. I thought I'd take her out, show her around town. Ruby wanted to flee as Emmett watched her, noting down her features. Do you mind if I have a chat with her? A private chat, of course. Maya eyed him warily, taking a sip of her drink. It's Rose's decision, she said finally, watching for Ruby's reaction. Ruby realized that this was an opportunity to do something. Okay, she said hesitantly. Great, Emmett grinned, baring his fangs. We can go to that corner. He firmly took her forearm and pulled her behind him, Maya watching them the whole way. They sat down at an empty table, away from the groups of rowdy faunus. They sat in silence for a while, Emmett staring at her while Ruby tried to not look at him. It was faint, but I could smell the blood on you, he said suddenly. Who did you kill? Ruby felt a little faint, her ears ringing, as her mind started backtracking into the past. And then she remembered that she had butchered the bear that afternoon, and blood had gotten onto her face and apparently her hair. It seemed that he had a stronger sense of smell than Maya. But she couldn't tell him that. No one, Ruby responded after a few seconds. I don't know what you're talking about. Emmett shook his head, laughing silently. That's fine, he said. I don't need to know. But I've seen how you look at Maya. She's a big girl and I know she can take care of herself, but you're eyeing her like she's a prime steak. Ruby blinked, wondering if she had been that obvious. She made a mental note to stop staring so much. I'm just her friend, Ruby protested. Of course, Emmett agreed amiably. But I just wanted to tell you that you could have some fun in another way. He leaned in closer, his voice lowering. Do you want to cause a little mayhem and hurt some people? Do you want to toy with those grass-eating prey faunus? Doesn't it get boring, cooped up in this tiny little town? Haven't you ever felt a need to hunt, to chase? He was bombarding her with questions, his words exactly echoing Ruby's suppressed thoughts. Emmett leaned back, smiling. I can see that you're quite happy with that idea. Ruby tried to still her emotions, but her head was filled with visions of bloodlust and gore, her hands trembling as they clutched the table, leaving behind imprints of her fingers. We can do that, Ruby asked. Emmett chuckled at her use of the word, we, knowing that she was already lumping herself in with the predators. Yeah, he said, standing up. Meet me here again tomorrow night, and you'll see what we can offer you. He walked back to Maya, leaving Ruby behind as she sat at the table and tried to settle her arousal. It took a while before Ruby could control herself and make it back to the bar. Sitting down and taking deep breaths, Maya looked worriedly at her. We should go, Maya said, finishing her drink. It's been a long day for both of us, and we need to get our rest. Emmett nodded. See you tomorrow, he said, staring pointedly at Ruby. Maya waved a goodbye and herded Ruby out of the bar, beginning their walk home. Neither of them spoke as they walked, Ruby letting the cold temperatures still her quivering body. Maya was clearly bursting with questions, but she recognized Ruby's agitated state and let her calm down. The fireplace was roaring, both of them sitting on the sofa, when Maya finally spoke up. I didn't get any information from him, Maya said, sighing. Some hints and clues about what he was going to do next, but nothing that I could use. So, what did he talk about with you? Ruby took a few moments to respond. He gave me an offer, Ruby said quietly. Maya's jaw dropped. That's amazing, she exclaimed, looking at Ruby. If you're in with them, you could tell me where they're going and what they're going to do. I could gather tons of evidence, and if you get their trust, you could find out where they've been keeping the stuff they've stolen. Ruby looked up. Really? She asked uncertainly. Yes, Maya said excitedly. This could change everything. You should join them, Red. Ruby wanted to protest, to say that she would have to commit those crimes if she wanted them to trust her. But she didn't want to ruin Maya's happiness, and she didn't want to acknowledge the other reason. Okay, Ruby said. But I'm not joining them because I want to do bad things, it's because I'm trying to help you, alright? Maya nodded. I understand, she said. Thank you. As Maya began to animatedly draw up plans and talk about what Ruby could do, Ruby wondered if she really had accepted just to help Maya. Chapter 44, Disguised PT3. I'll get you a microphone, or you can just send me information about their movements from your tablet, Maya said, pacing. I can try to follow you guys from the rooftops or I can get there beforehand and set up cameras. Ruby didn't really have anything to contribute, so she just nodded. The main problem is how convincing you can be, Maya said, turning and looking at her. You don't seem to be that bad of a person, so I'm wondering how you can get them to trust you. What should I do? Ruby asked. Or, better said, what can I do? Should I participate? Can I break any laws? Maya paused, considering her options. You'll probably have to commit some crimes, Maya said hesitantly. If you want to seem credible, you're going to need to prove yourself. That won't be a problem, Ruby said, trying not to sound too eager. Undercover cops are usually held to a guideline of what crimes they can or cannot commit, Maya explained. They usually can participate in transferring narcotics and other small-scale crimes, but they aren't allowed to commit murder or participate in an assault. Oh, Ruby said, hiding her disappointment. But you're not a cop, Maya continued. I might get into trouble for saying this, but do whatever it takes to keep yourself alive. If you have to do something to avoid blowing your cover, then do it. Ruby was stunned, surprised at the advice that Maya was giving her. Wait, aren't you a police officer? Shouldn't you be telling me to follow the law no matter what? Maya sighed, leaning back in the couch and rubbing her eyes. I can't bear to have another death on my conscience. And for some odd reason, despite everything I've heard about you, I sort of like you, no matter how annoying you are sometimes. Ruby leaned forward, an eager expression on her face. Really? 'Cause I like you too. Maya gently pushed her back. As a person, I like you as a person. Stop being creepy again. Ruby whined, crestfallen. Maya looked at the clock. It's getting late, she said. Take a shower and change back into your old clothes before you leave. I really need to get some sleep this time. Ruby didn't want to depart from her new life, but she recognized the importance of keeping her upper ruse. Okay, she said, standing up. Should I just leave the contacts and the clothes here? Yeah, Maya responded, lying down and taking the space Ruby had just occupied. I'll sort them out, she yawned. If I'm not tired, we can go on a shopping trip for some extra clothes tomorrow. I'll message you when I get home. Ruby nodded. I'll go take the shower now, she said, walking towards the bathroom. Maya didn't respond, having fallen asleep already. Ruby stripped off her clothes and neatly placed them into a pile, stacking them beside Maya's bed. Peeking into the living room and making sure that Maya was still asleep, she dove into the blankets, rolling around and clutching it, breathing in Maya's scent. A few minutes later, she stopped, panting, realizing what she was doing and blushing a little. Reluctantly getting off of the bed, she smoothed out the blankets and placed her clothes them, hoping that Maya wouldn't realize what she had done. The contact lenses were still on the living room table, so she crept out and grabbed them, careful not to wake Maya. She carefully took out her lenses and placed them into the case after swapping out the fluid inside. Placing the case on the sink and turning the shower on, Ruby went to the hallway and rummaged through the cabinet for a towel, finding only soft white fluffy ones and hoping that Maya wouldn't mind. The shower was steaming hot when she stepped in. Using the bar-on soap on the side, she lathered her hair, black dye dripping out as she soaked her head. After she washed all of the soap away, she stepped out of the shower, wiping down the mirror and checking her hair. True to her word, the dye had mostly washed away, the red of her hair visible again. Stepping back into the shower and washing a few more times, she savored the sensation of the warm water for a couple more minutes before turning it off. Toweling herself dry, she checked again to make sure her hair was clean before wrapping the towel around herself and going back to Maya's bedroom. Ruby rummaged around her jean pockets until she found the key to the safe. She carefully made her way down the basement, the wooden stairs cold beneath her bare feet. Feeling for the cabinet in the wall, she slid it open and unlocked the safe, pulling her bundle of belongings out. After shutting the door to the safe and placing the key in her pouch, she walked back upstairs, unfolding her cloak. She changed in Maya's bedroom, slipping the scraps of her dress around herself and replacing the steel silk wraps. The cloak went around her shoulders, the crosses clipping it into place, and she stomped the boots back onto her feet. The belt went around her waist, her weapon clipping onto the back. Once she was fully dressed, a feeling of wholeness clashed with spikes of loneliness and sadness, making Ruby check on Maya again before heading out. Maya was breathing slowly, deep asleep, so Ruby tucked the blanket more snugly around her, resisting the urge to do anything else. Taking one last glance at the sleeping rabbit, she exited through the window, leaving the front door locked. The moon barely illuminated the wall as Ruby scaled it with her scythe, rappelling up and jumping off of the other side. Slamming into the crunchy snow, she retraced her steps and ran back towards her camp, wondering if her Beowulfs were okay. 6 large furry shapes appeared the moment Ruby got near her campsite, running up and brushing against her to check that she was there. Ruby reassured them with soft words, assessing their condition and making sure that they were getting enough food. They seemed healthy, the hunting having been good in these mild weather conditions. Ruby had already eaten dinner and it was late, so she just lay down in her tent and set the cloak on the ground, wrapping herself up and going to sleep. Ruby woke up early the next morning, the sun still low in the sky as she left her tent. Wondering if Vincent would contact her today, she carved a few sticks and set up the cooking stand. She dragged the bear steaks out of the snow, slicing them into chunks, and speared them onto the makeshift skewers. While she let them heat up, she checked on the bear skin she had hung from the tree branches. The skin was mostly dry now, a tough leather, and Ruby wondered what she could do with it. Taking a little bit of fat from the bear meat she had, she smeared the leather with it and rolled it up, hoping that the oils in the fat would keep the leather from getting brittle and cracking. Using another sheet of tarp, she covered the entire roll and placed it in her tent, protecting it from the elements. The frozen bear meat had thawed now, so Ruby took some chunks and wolfed them down, eating them for breakfast. She let the rest continue to cook, wondering how bear jerky would taste. Ruby spent the rest of the morning wandering around the woods and collecting more firewood, waiting until it was nearly noon to make sure that Vincent's messengers weren't going to come. Bored out of her mind and realizing she had nothing to do for the rest of the day, Ruby made her way back to New Haven, walking through the forest and into the clearing, watching out for the guards on the walls. Seeing that her spot had remained undetected, Ruby scaled the handholds on the wall, climbing up and rappelling down the other side in broad daylight, grateful that Maya's neighborhood was empty. Maya had already left for work, so Ruby flipped the shutters open and crawled in through the kitchen window. Her clothes were still left on the bed, Maya apparently having slept on the couch the entire night, so Ruby changed into them. Taking off her current clothes, she switched into the sweater and jeans. The tablet wouldn't fit into the pocket of her jeans, so she took it out and sent a message to Maya, saying that Vincent hadn't come, before placing it back into her pouch. She stored the bundle of her dress and cloak into the basement safe, locking it with the key in the pouch and putting the key into the pocket of her jeans. The canister of dye was still in Maya's bedroom, so she applied it in the mirror again, careful to get all of the red parts of her hair. Going to the bathroom, she washed her hands and put on the contacts, fitting them snugly into place and mussing up her hair again. The blue contacts were less irritating this time, Ruby quickly growing used to them. She left through the window again, closing the shutters behind her. Ruby had no real destination, so she walked toward the center of town, wondering if she would be able to find the police station. The sun was shining brightly overhead as Ruby walked down the lonely path. She looked around her, trying to make out the details of the other towns, but they were all too far away. Her sweater was beginning to grow a little too warm, but she kept it on, realizing that she wasn't wearing anything underneath. The outskirts of the town was mostly empty, 1 or 2 people scurrying around busily, but most people were off at work. No one looked at her as she walked down the streets, apparently just another Faunus. As she walked towards the center of town, more signs of life appeared. More people were on the streets, and Ruby saw a few construction projects taking place, new buildings being erected by builder Faunus. Ruby wanted to buy some clothes, but she realized that she didn't have enough money. Wandering around, she looked at the shops, checking out the signs and seeing what there was to buy. There were a few shops selling various clothing, shoes, and fabrics, and there were also shops selling food products of meats and vegetables. Ruby suspected that most people were off in their own communities, tending to their vegetable plots or taking care of their farm animals. As she walked, more people started appearing, Faunus streaming in to meet up and eat lunch in the city. A few delivery trucks rumbled by, delivering supplies to the shops. Ruby didn't want to just wander around all day, so she stopped and sat down on a bench, thinking. She disliked relying on Maya, and she wanted to keep up her identity in the Faunus town. Vincent was an issue, but for now she could just sneak into town after waiting in the morning. The main problem was money, and Ruby couldn't do anything if she didn't have any money. Standing up, she looked around at the groups of Faunus, beginning to follow them. She tried not to look too obvious as she followed the Faunus around, eventually being led to the area with clusters of restaurants. Breaking off from the group, she walked down the street, looking for any help wanted signs or things of that nature. After walking past a few shops, she stopped at an herbivore restaurant, a simple sign advertising a need for employees at the door. Ruby figured that since she didn't really have any skills in cooking or making things, she might be able to do something simple, like manning a cashier. Walking up to one of the waiters, Ruby asked if he knew how she might be able to apply for the job position. The waiter glanced at her, scoffing, his round ears twitching. "You're not welcome here," he said, pointedly sniffing at her. "You wouldn't get the job even if you applied, carnivore." Ruby frowned. What do you mean? "You eat flesh," the waiter said, tapping his foot impatiently. "Does this look like a carnivore establishment to you?" he asked, pointing at the sign in the front. "I just wanted to know if I could apply for a cashier position or something like that," Ruby said, surprised by his attitude. The manager came over, having noticed the disturbance. He started asking what was wrong, but his face suddenly stilled, an impassive expression taking over his face as he realized what Ruby was. "Please leave," he said coldly. "We don't serve your kind around here." Ruby nodded, turning around and quickly leaving the restaurant. As she walked down the street, she reflected on what had just happened. It seemed that things were just as bad as Maya had said. Ruby couldn't really blame them for discriminating against the carnivores, considering what was going on in the town, and she wasn't really that offended, as she wasn't really a Faunus anyways. Just to make sure, she tried her luck at the next two restaurants, both of them herbivore establishments. Both of them rejected her before she could even ask, her scent or rather the lack thereof giving her away. By this time, most of the Faunus were already heading out again, their lunch breaks over. Ruby wanted to ask someone for directions, but she didn't see any police officers on the streets, and she didn't really know any of the Faunus. After wandering around for a while, she found a carnivore shop, the red labeling on the window proclaiming it to be meat eaters only. Pushing open the door, Ruby stepped inside and looked around, seeing that most of the customers were already gone. A lone Faunus was at a table, wiping it down. The little Faunus had red fox ears and bright red hair, and Ruby couldn't decide whether it was male or female as she watched it from behind. The fox wore busser uniform, dressed neatly in a white shirt and black pants, an apron draped across its front. It was busily cleaning the table with a rag, wiping the wooden surface until it was gleaming and then loading the dishes onto a small cart. Ruby cleared her throat. Excuse me," she said. "Are you guys hiring?" The fox Faunus turned around, and Ruby's breath caught in her throat. Ruby still couldn't tell what gender it was, but she was captivated by its large green eyes and delicate facial features, an innocent expression on its face. "Oh my god, you are so cute," Ruby squealed, dashing forward and wrapping her arms around the little fox. The Faunus dropped its plate, surprised. It said nervously, even its voice gender neutral. Ruby nuzzled it for a few more seconds, deciding that the fox was probably a male by his lack of a chest. She breathed in his soft scent, rubbing her nose against his colorful hair. He started blushing as he realized that Ruby's chest was pressed against him. Ruby realized what she was doing and backed off, an embarrassed expression on her face. "Sorry about that," she apologized. That's fine," he mumbled, looking down. "Did you say something about wanting a job?" Ruby's fingers itched to touch him, so she twined her hands together behind her. "Are you guys hiring?" "Yeah," he said, looking up again, interested. "I'll go get the manager." "What's your name?" "Rose," Ruby responded. "I'm Rowan," he said, smiling for the first time. "Nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too," Ruby smiled back, glad he was warming up to her. "I'll be right back," he promised, heading towards a door in the back. Rowan came back in a few seconds with his manager, a middle-aged wolf faunus, his hair streaked with gray and his face lined with creases. He wore an oil-stained chef's uniform, a towel between his hands as he wiped his fingers off. "I'm Mingan," he said, holding out his hand. "You here for a job?" Ruby took his hand, shaking it. "Yes sir," she said. "You don't need to pay me much, I just need something to do." Mingan let out a deep laugh, surprising Ruby. "That's not something I usually hear from teenagers, and especially not from reptile faunus," he said mirthfully. "What can you do?" "Not a lot," Ruby admitted. "But I can do whatever the others don't want to do." Mingan scratched his ears, thinking. "We're actually short on workers right now, because no one wants to take the menial tasks," he said. "Some of us are just too damn proud for our own good. Would you be willing to do some of the less desirable work around here?" "Like what?" Ruby asked curiously. "Rowan here can't really handle all of the cleaning jobs by himself," he said, amid the fox's protests, "and our dishwasher just quit a few days ago, citing something about better job opportunities. Would you be willing to do some general cleaning and switch off on doing the dishes with Rowan? You'll need to be here by 10 in the morning, and you'll need to stay until 7. "Sounds great," Ruby said, making a mental note to tell Maya about the mysterious job departure. "When can I get started?" "Right now," Mingan said, heading into the kitchen and motioning for her to follow. The wolf faunus pushed the door open, Ruby right behind him. She looked around the moderately sized kitchen. A set of stovetops and grills were in the middle of the room, counters for food preparation lined up against the three sides of the walls. They were made out of a mixture of metal and stone, the stovetops gleaming steel while the countertops were a brown granite. The smell of roasted meat permeated the room, animal flesh clearly the main course being served in this restaurant. Mingan pulled out an apron, tossing it to Ruby. Ruby had to wrap strings multiple times around her waist before it stopped slipping down, the apron clearly made for someone a few sizes larger than her. The sink full of plates was set in the center of one of the counters, and Ruby walked over to it, careful not to trip on the long apron. Remembering the countless chores that Yang had pushed onto her, Ruby began cleaning the dishes, filling the sink with hot water and starting on the silverware, trying to scrub the nostalgic thoughts out of her mind. Rowan went back to get more dishes while Mingan supervised her for a few minutes, nodding with approval after a while and leaving her alone. "So where are the other employees?" Ruby asked, helping Rowan move the dishes from the cart to the sink. "They're probably out getting a drink or something," Rowan said. "We don't have many customers in the afternoon, so Mingan lets them have the afternoons off on slow days like today." "So Mingan is the chef and the manager?" Ruby asked. Rowan nodded. "He's really good at cooking, and he could probably run the place by himself if he wanted to," Rowan said. "But, with the government encouraging more hiring and everything, I think he feels a need to do something." Ruby nodded, pretending she knew what he was talking about. They finished loading the dishes into the sink, the two of them making quick work of the pile. "Talk to you later, Rose," Rowan said, heading back towards the door. "I have to go clean up while we don't have any customers." "No problem," Ruby said, staring at him as she watched him leave. "No problem at all," she muttered, going back to washing the dishes, daydreaming about how Rowan's flesh would taste. Chapter 45, Disguised PT4. Ruby finished cleaning the last dish, stacking it on the rack and toweling her hands. She walked back to the main room, where Rowan was still sweeping the floor, all the tabletops now shiny and pristine. She simply watched him for a few minutes, straddling a chair and admiring him as he obliviously cleaned. Sweeping the pile into a dustpan, he turned around and nearly dropped it, surprised by Ruby's intent stare. "Don't mind me," Ruby said dismissively. "Just keep doing what you have to do." "It's nice to have someone to talk to," Rowan said, recovering from his shock and emptying the dustpan into the trash can. "I don't really see a lot of people my age around here, and the fox community doesn't really have a lot of children. Although, I suppose that's true for all the communities." Ruby was interested, reminding herself to ask Maya about that too. "So where did you come from? I mean, what did you do before you came here?" "My parents were farmers," Rowan said, sitting down in a chair next to Ruby. "We moved here to continue farming, although we mostly raise livestock now." Why are you working here then? Do I look like I can work on a farm? Ruby looked at the small fox Faunus, his feminine frame making him seem elegant and fragile. Not really, Ruby admitted. Rowan let out a sigh. Exactly. I think my parents realized even before I did, so they encouraged me to do something with myself and get a job in this city. What about your education? Ruby asked curiously. Rose, my parents are farmers, Rowan said, smiling. I went to middle school and they thought that was enough. Besides, then we relocated here for the government benefits, and because my parents wanted to help make a change for the Faunus race. I see, Ruby said. Have you been working here for long? Rowan shook his head. I just started about a week ago, around the time that the previous busboy quit. Mingan was nice enough to give me a job, so now I'm here. What about you? Ruby paused for a second, trying to think of something. Well, my parents are dead, she said semi-truthfully. That's horrible, Rowan gasped, putting a hand to his mouth. I'm so sorry for asking. Wait, that came out poorly, Ruby said, backtracking. I mean, my parents are dead, but I was, adopted. Some things happened, and then I heard about this settlement project and signed up, and here I am. Did your family move here with you? I was adopted by a human family, Ruby said, thinking quickly. We had a sort of fallout, and then I came here alone. That's so sad, Rowan said, his eyes a little teary. Do you miss your family? A little, sometimes, Ruby said hesitantly. But I'd like to think that I'm over it by now. They sat in silence, looking out the windows as they watched a few Faunus pass by. What do you do here? Rowan asked, his curiosity prompting him to break the silence. I don't think I've seen you before, although I haven't been around much. I was by myself, not really doing anything, Ruby said, reciting her rehearsed story. You know, picking up the government handouts, wandering around. And then I moved in with a friend and decided to find a job because I was getting a little bored. Rowan nodded, refraining from bothering her with more questions about her past. Mingan walked into the room a few minutes later, interrupting their discussion about hunters and huntresses. In about an hour or so, some of my earlier customers are going to arrive, Mingan said. Do you two want to make yourselves useful and help with the food preparation? Ruby looked at Rowan, and Rowan shrugged. Sure, Ruby said, but I'm not sure what I could help you with. Mingan motioned for them to follow as he headed towards the kitchen. Can you cut things? He asked. Yup, Ruby answered enthusiastically. I think so, Rowan said at the same time. Good. Mingan nonchalantly handed them 2 butcher knives. Rowan gently set it on the countertop, careful of its weight, while Ruby hefted it in her palm, testing its balance. Mingan went to the refrigerator and pulled out a huge chunk of meat, holding it with one hand while pulling out a large wooden cutting board and sliding it onto the countertop. Setting the chunk of meat down, he told them how to cut it. He watched them until he was sure they knew what they were doing, then went back to his office. Where are the other employees? Ruby asked, chopping carefully. Oh, they'll get here in about half an hour, Rowan responded. You were saying something about hunters. I find them so interesting. I didn't learn much about history in middle school, he explained. They are the guardians of the human kingdoms, Ruby said. Although in more recent times they've protected kingdoms against other people instead of Grimm. Why? Rowan asked. Aren't they supposed to be humanity's weapon against Grimm? Ruby nodded. But Grimm attacks have been dying down over the past few centuries, and by now most people look up to them as elite soldiers, rather than protectors. They continued chatting for a while until the other workers began to arrive, back from their excursions in town. Rowan's nose twitched. They've been drinking again, he said, frowning. Why is Mingan putting up with this? Ruby asked, watching the inebriated cooks unsteadily begin cooking. Well, Mingan gets extra money from the government if he hires more people, Rowan said, chopping a little harder than necessary. And since the food being prepared is simple, them being drunk doesn't really affect the quality of the dishes. So as long as they do the work and Mingan gets paid, Mingan doesn't mind much. Rowan saw her confusion. Mingan isn't a bad person, he amended, but I wish he'd fire some of these people. One of the chefs staggered over, as if on cue. And this is one of them, he muttered, looking apprehensive. A man with weasel ears strutted over, a scar on one side of his face and a weak chin decorating his jaw. He had dull green eyes and dull brown hair, a nasty smile on his face. "Hey Rowan," he grinned, edging uncomfortably close. "Remember what I said earlier?" Rowan gulped. "Why yes," he stuttered. "I already agreed, Cedric." "Good," Cedric said, his yellow teeth doing nothing to help his looks. Ruby watched with interest as Cedric squeezed Rowan's bottom, making the little fox involuntarily squeak. "Hey, we have knives, you know," Ruby said, pointing her knife at Cedric. "Ooh, scary," Cedric smirked, throwing up his hands in mock terror. But he walked away anyways, going back to work. "Thanks," Rowan said, sighing and rubbing the sore spot. Ruby sidled up to him. "So now that I've saved you, do I get a reward?" she asked, putting an arm around him. What?" Rowan squeaked, freezing. Ruby gave him a peck on the cheek, then backed away, pushing down her urges. "Never mind," she said, smiling. Rowan looked at her nervously, then picked up his knife and started chopping again. "Why don't you tell Mingan?" Ruby asked after a little bit of silence. "Well, I just started working here, and I don't want to run to Mingan for everything," Rowan said defensively. "And besides, I can take care of myself." "Of course," Ruby said, not wanting to argue with him. Ruby suddenly remembered something. "I need to tell Maya where I am," she said hurriedly, washing off her hands and wiping them dry. "Do you have a tablet I could borrow?" Rowan shook his head. "Is Maya your friend?" he asked. "And you could go ask Mingan and see if he has a tablet." Ruby nodded and quickly walked out of the room, ignoring the looks from the other chefs. Mingan's door was locked, some muffled sounds coming from inside. "You okay in there?" Ruby asked. There was some cursing, a chair scraping across the floor, a squeak that was decidedly feminine. "I'm fine," Mingan called out, his voice a little gruff. "What do you need?" "Sorry for bothering you," Ruby apologized. "Do you have a tablet I could borrow?" "It's on the counter," Mingan responded. "Password is GRYWLF. Ruby looked around the dining room, finding a small counter at the register and a tablet next to it. Swiping it open, she typed in the password and called Maya. A few rings later, Maya picked up, her worried profile filling the screen. "Hello?" she asked. "Red. What are you doing with someone else's tablet?" I found a job," Ruby said, unsure how to begin. "I'll be back by 7. "A job?" Maya asked, raising an eyebrow. "You're in New Haven right now." "I'm, establishing my identity and all that," Ruby said. "If you called me, I didn't pick up because the tablet is at your house." "I saw," Maya said. "I'm at home right now. Why didn't you bring it with you?" "I didn't have anywhere to put it," Ruby explained. "It wouldn't fit in my jeans." Maya palmed her face. "We're getting you a handbag as soon as possible," she decided. "Where are you working?" Ruby picked up the tablet and walked to the window, trying to read the sign backwards. "The Grey Wolf Eatery," Ruby said. That's not very creative." "A carnivore shop?" Maya asked, interested. "I'm going to have to ask you a few questions when you get back." "No problem," Ruby said. "I have some questions too." Maya nodded. "Alright, I guess I'll see you at 7. Stay safe." "Yes ma'am," Ruby smiled, and ended the call. "Who were you calling?" Rowan asked as Ruby went back to cutting the meat. "The friend I moved in with," Ruby said, careful not to divulge any details. "You wouldn't know her." "You already said her name was Maya," Rowan reminded her. "Is she an herbivore?" "Not that I have anything against them, of course." "Yeah," Ruby conceded. "You don't dislike them." Rowan shook his head. "No, I think it's stupid," he said bluntly. "We're all faunus, aren't we? Some are bad people, but it has nothing to do with their eating habits." "That's so sweet," Ruby gushed, giving Rowan a surprise hug and nearly lifting him off of the ground. "I can't breathe," Rowan wheezed. Sorry, Ruby said, setting him down and going back to work. Ruby left at 7, saying a goodbye to Rowan as they parted ways in front of the shop. The dinner rush was over, most of the customers gone already, so Mingan let them and some other employees go for the night. See you tomorrow, Ruby said, waving to Rowan. See you, he replied, walking away. Ruby looked around, realizing that she was lost. It was nighttime and streetlights illuminated the road, but Rowan was already gone. Crud, she muttered, realizing that she'd have to go ask someone for directions. Lost? Maya asked, clearly amused. Ruby spun around, surprised to see Maya walking up to her. I just got here, Maya said, smiling. How was your day? Good. Thanks for picking me up, Ruby said gratefully. I'm not sure where we are right now. Maya pointed towards the street signs. Remember them, she said, beginning to walk. I'm surprised you didn't get lost in the wilderness. I had my tablet, Ruby explained. It has a GPS and a map on it. That explains it, Maya chuckled. Did you eat yet? Ruby shook her head. I was going to eat with you. What, you don't like meat? Meat is good, Ruby assured her. But I didn't think you'd want to eat at the carnivore restaurant. You're being clingy, Red, Maya scolded her. Let's just go get some noodles again, unless you want something else. Noodles are good too, Ruby said quickly. How far is it from here? I'm starving. Pretty close, Maya said. The restaurants are all clustered near each other. They reached their destination in a few minutes, Maya pushing open the door and sitting down in the same spot as last time. I tried to get a job at some herbivore restaurants, Ruby began. But they turned me down instantly. How come I can eat in here? They know me, Maya said, taking off her parka. And I know the owner. Why did you try to get a job? Ruby shifted uncomfortably. I didn't want to depend on you, she explained. I wanted some of my own money to spend. Sounds good, Maya agreed. Now you won't just be a parasite. Hey, Ruby cried, indignant. I'm useful. Maya called the waiter over, placing their orders. Oh yeah. Ruby racked her brain. In the past few weeks, a few people have quit their jobs at the place I was working at, she offered. They said something about, and I quote, better job opportunities. Did you ask what type of faunus they were? Ruby shook her head. Maya thought for a moment. That's fine, she said. It doesn't really matter, not when they're so obviously quitting their jobs to commit crimes instead. You think so? Maya nodded. Why work at a low-paying, thankless job if you can just go rob and steal? Robbing and stealing is probably more exciting than being a cashier. Do you think you could get their names? I'll try, Ruby said. But I don't want to make them suspicious. Do what you can, Maya said. You might be able to find out more tonight. Ruby blinked for a second, her eyes widening in comprehension. Oh right, I have the meeting with Emmett tonight. She looked up, glancing at the clock. Do you think we're late? She asked worriedly. Maya shook her head. We're fine, she said. The noodles arrived, Ruby and Maya digging in. There aren't a lot of kids in this town, Ruby observed. Why is that? It's simple, Maya said. People with children aren't as willing to uproot themselves and join some far-off settlement. That makes sense, Ruby said. I met this fox faunus at the restaurant today, and he was my age. So I guess that's pretty rare. Maya nodded, swallowing her mouthful before speaking. That's interesting, she said. But you'll have to tell me more later. We need to finish our food and get going. Ruby quickly ate the rest of her noodles, drinking down the soup, Maya already finished as usual. So what's the plan? Ruby asked, following Maya to the door. Go up and talk to him, Maya said, buttoning up her parka and pushing open the door. I'll try to follow you if you guys go anywhere, but I have to be cautious because I can't let them see me. You'll have to be observant and remember everything. Apparently we didn't request any bugging devices, because no one thought they would be useful out here, so you're on your own. Okay, Ruby said, trying to stay calm. Maya slapped her back. Act natural, she said. Don't look too confident, but don't let them pick on you. Pretend you're a predator. Ruby let out a breath. I can do that, she told herself. They soon arrived at the bar, Maya casually walking inside, Ruby trying to imitate her. Emmett was in the same place, sitting back and waiting for her, but this time he had two other people next to him. You, Cedric stared, recognizing her. You're the new one. Next to the weasel faunus sat a tall, long-limbed man, dark-skinned with spotted ears in his head. Ah, hi, Ruby said, also surprised to see him. Good to see you, Maya, Emmett said, standing up. But we have some business to attend to. We were just waiting for Rose. Not even one drink? Maya asked, pretending to be disappointed. Emmett shook his head. See you tomorrow, Maya. The three of them turned to leave, heading for the door. Ruby looked at Maya, unsure of what to do, and Maya gestured for her to follow them. Go, she mouthed. Ruby nodded and walked quickly, catching up to them just as they reached the door. No one said a word as they walked down the street towards some unknown destination. Another woman, also a cheetah faunus, slinked out of the shadows, silently joining their group. Ruby attempted to make conversation. So, where are we going? She asked, her voice awkwardly fading away as she noticed that none of them even looked at her. Be quiet, Emmett growled. Ruby sealed her lips, just following them. She wanted to look back to see if Maya was behind them, but she didn't want to give anything away. They got to their destination half an hour later, the group silently making a complicated series of twists and turns that left Ruby bewildered. They stopped at the outskirts of the town, in front of an abandoned, run-down two-story home. A faint light showed through the cracks of the boarded-up windows, and Ruby heard snatches of conversation coming from inside. Emmett rapped on the door, making a distinctive knocking pattern. It's us, he said. The door opened up immediately, a large man with black-tipped orange and white tiger ears standing in the doorway. New member? He asked happily, stepping aside. Emmett nodded, walking inside. Ruby had no choice but to follow him, the tiger closing the door and locking it behind her. Which reptile? He asked, pacing himself and walking with Ruby. Snake, Ruby answered immediately, remembering Mark. The tiger nodded in approval. As they walked down the hallways, Ruby caught glimpses of the other rooms. Groups of carnivores were meeting up, planning out the night's activities. Emmett led his own group to one of the empty rooms, shutting the door behind them. The tiger remained outside. The room was bare, the floor wooden, the walls undecorated. The only window was sealed with wooden planks, and the only furniture in the room was a large rectangular table surrounded with more chairs than needed. Emmett turned to her, suddenly patting her down and checking her pockets. Ruby didn't do anything, assuming that this was standard procedure, and Emmett seemed to be mostly professional, perhaps taking a little too long in her chest. Clear, Emmett said. They each took seats, the faunus now beginning to talk. What are you doing here? Cedric sneered. Shouldn't you be out protecting the weak? Quiet, Emmett said, silencing him. Rose, do you know what we do? No. We hunt, hissed the cheetahs. We have some fun, and we make a little money on the side, Emmett explained. Some extortion, threatening, general mayhem, toying with the grass eaters. He grinned, licking his fangs. You in? His words and his suggestive actions made Ruby's blood thrum, her body heating up. Yes, Ruby said decisively. She is young, one of the cheetahs said. She is weak, the other one clarified. Don't make judgments too quickly, Emmett said, smiling. He nodded to Cedric. The chair clattered to the ground as the weasel leapt out of it, hands extended. Ruby instinctively slammed a palm into his chest and sent him flying into the wall. He slid down, unable to stand, gasping in pain. The cheetah stared. See, Emmett said triumphantly. He pointed at Ruby. I could see it in her eyes. The male faunus nodded slowly, but the female still looked unconvinced. But can she hunt? Can she understand, enjoy, the thrill? We'll see tonight, Emmett said. And I think we'll have a lot more fun now that we have another person to run with us. Cedric slowly got up, unhappily setting his chair upright and taking a seat again. Ruby's heart was still pounding, her body filled with adrenaline. Emmett grinned, pleased with Ruby's reaction. Let's start with the introductions.